Officers arrested Barron Trump, but the moment his mother, Melania Trump, intervened, everything changed. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching us from. The night stretched endlessly as Barron Trump drove down the deserted highway. The road was flanked by fields that seemed to dissolve into shadows, their outlines barely visible in the dim moonlight. Sparse street lights cast occasional beams of yellowish glow, but the overwhelming darkness pressed down, creating an uneasy stillness. Barron tried to focus on the rhythmic hum of the tires against the asphalt, but the emptiness around him made the world feel too quiet. The air conditioning hummed faintly in the background as he adjusted the volume on the car's stereo, letting soft, calming music fill the space. He stole a quick glance at the dashboard clock, 10:42 p.m. Still early enough to get home without raising any questions, but late enough for his mother to text if he was much longer. He knew he should have started back earlier, but time always slipped away when he finally got to hang out with people who treated him like just another teenager. The leather-wrapped steering wheel felt cool under his hands as he gripped it, his fingers tapping lightly in rhythm with the music. The car, sleek, modern, and entirely out of place on this lonely stretch of road, seemed to glide effortlessly, but Barron's posture remained tense. He hated driving alone at night, especially through areas like this. It reminded him too much of his father's lectures about safety, about always being aware of his surroundings. But tonight, he just wanted to forget the expectations, the scrutiny, and the headlines. He wanted to feel normal, even if it was only for a short drive through the back roads of Texas. In the rearview mirror, a faint glimmer caught his eye. Headlights approaching in the distance. At first, it barely registered. It was just another car sharing the same road. But then, the lights grew brighter, closing the distance too quickly to ignore. Barron shifted uneasily in his seat. The music suddenly felt too loud, so he turned it off, leaving only the sound of the tires and his own breathing. The car behind him didn't pass. Instead, it lingered in his rearview mirror, the headlights glaring, reflecting off the mirrors and making it hard to focus on the road. A sharp, quick flash of red and blue lights pierced the night, and Barron's heart sank. He signaled and pulled over to the shoulder, coming to a gentle stop as the patrol car rolled in behind him. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. This wasn't the first time he'd been singled out. He'd learned long ago that being a Trump meant always being seen, even when he wanted to disappear. A flicker of panic ran through him, but he forced himself to stay calm. He reached for his wallet, pulling out his ID and license, then set both hands firmly on the steering wheel where they could be seen. He'd been coached for moments like this: stay polite, don't argue, comply with every instruction. The beam of a flashlight sliced through the darkness, illuminating the interior of the car as the officer approached. Barron squinted against the light, but didn't move. The first officer appeared in the window. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and middle-aged, with close-cropped gray hair and a hard expression. Something about the way he leaned down to peer into the car felt aggressive, calculated. "License and registration," the officer said flatly. Barron handed them over without speaking, letting the man examine them under the harsh beam of the flashlight. The second officer hung back slightly, younger, thinner, and visibly more uncomfortable. He avoided eye contact as he circled the car, shining his own light across the windows. The older officer grunted as he looked at the license. "Trump?" His eyes flicked back to Barron, sharp and appraising. "You're one of those Trumps?" Barron's stomach tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Yes, sir." The officer's mouth twisted slightly, as if he'd just confirmed a suspicion. "What brings you out here, son? Looks like a long way from home." "I was visiting a friend in town. Heading back now." The officer nodded, but his expression didn't soften. "Late hour to be out driving a car like this." Barron didn't respond. He knew where this was going, and the officer seemed to enjoy dragging it out. "You mind stepping out of the vehicle for me?" A flash of irritation flared in Barron's chest, but he pushed it down. He reached for the door handle, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The air felt colder when he stepped outside, the gravel crunching under his shoes as he stood by the car. The second officer hovered nearby, his hand resting close to his holster. Barron caught the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Hesitation, maybe even guilt, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. The older officer circled him like a predator sizing up its prey. "Nice clothes," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "And that watch looks expensive. You sure this car's yours?" Barron clenched his jaw. "I rented it." "Convenient." Barron swallowed hard. He could feel the tension building, like the air before a storm. "Any alcohol or drugs in the car?" "No, sir." "You sure about that?" The officer leaned in closer, his tone sharp. "Yes." "Then you won't mind if we take a look?" Barron froze. He knew he had rights, but arguing would only make things worse. The officer was already enjoying himself too much. "Go ahead," Barron said through gritted teeth. The second officer hesitated but joined the search, opening the car doors and rifling through the glove compartment and back seat. Barron stood still, his fists clenched at his sides, trying to keep his breathing steady as his belongings were handled without care. The older officer smirked when he found a backpack in the trunk. "What's in here?" "Books, laptop. Mind if I check?" Barron didn't answer. He didn't need to. The officer was already unzipping it. The search dragged on, but they found nothing. Even so, the officer's expression didn't change. "Not carrying any weapons?" "No." The flashlight lingered on Barron's face. "You sure seem nervous for someone with nothing to hide." Barron's voice finally cracked. "I'm nervous because you're treating me like a criminal." The words hung in the air for a moment before the older officer laughed, a short, harsh sound. "Well, kid, around here we don't give free passes, not even to celebrities." Barron flinched at the word. It felt like an accusation, not a fact. "Hands on the hood," the officer ordered. Barron hesitated. "Now?" The weight of the flashlight against his shoulder forced him forward. As he placed his hands on the hood, his mind raced. He needed to get out of this. He needed help. But before he could think of what to do next, the officer reached for his phone and threw it to the ground. The screen shattered on impact. "Looks like you're going to be staying with us for a while." The words sent a jolt of fear through him. He felt trapped, outnumbered, and helpless. And that's when the first flash of headlights appeared in the distance, growing closer. Barron's palms pressed against the cold metal of the car's hood, his breathing shallow as he tried to keep himself calm. The officer's flashlight hovered near his head, its beam bouncing off the polished surface. The younger officer, Davis, stood a few feet away, pretending to check the contents of the car, but casting quick, uneasy glances toward his partner. The older officer, Jackson, stepped closer, his shadow stretching over Barron like a net tightening around its catch. "Let me ask you something," Jackson said, his voice low and sharp. "What's a kid like you doing out here in the middle of nowhere, driving a car like this?" Barron didn't answer immediately. He knew anything he said could be twisted. "Visiting a friend," he said finally, keeping his voice steady. "Visiting a friend." Jackson repeated, his tone mocking. "And what kind of friend are we talking about? The kind that hands out expensive cars to rich boys with famous names?" Barron turned his head slightly, meeting the officer's eyes. "I rented the car." Jackson leaned in closer. "And I'm supposed to believe that?" "Yes," Barron replied, his voice sharper than he intended. Jackson's jaw tightened. He stepped back and motioned to Davis, who came over reluctantly. "Search it again," Jackson barked, "and be thorough this time." Davis hesitated, glancing at Barron before nodding and walking back to the car. Barron heard the sound of the trunk popping open and bags being shuffled. He clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to turn around. "Look, I've given you everything you asked for," Barron said, trying to keep his voice even. "My ID, my registration, everything checks out. What else do you need?" Jackson smirked, crossing his arms. "You think this is just about paperwork? What else would it be about?" Jackson stepped closer again, so near that Barron could smell the faint trace of coffee and tobacco on his breath. "This is about respect," Jackson said, "something kids like you don't seem to understand. You think just because you've got a fancy name and expensive shoes, you're above the rules?" "I didn't do anything wrong," Barron shot back, his voice rising. Jackson's eyes narrowed. "You're raising your voice now? That's not a good idea." Barron froze, realizing his mistake. He tried to take a breath, to backtrack, but Jackson was already seizing the moment. "Hands behind your back," he ordered. Barron's pulse spiked. "What? No. Why?" "Resisting instructions," Jackson snapped. "You're starting to act suspicious, and I don't like suspicious." Davis paused from his rummaging and looked up. "Sir?" Jackson shot him a glare that silenced whatever protest Davis might have had. "Do it," Jackson said firmly. Davis stepped forward, but his movements were slower, more hesitant. "Sir, he hasn't done anything. Maybe we should just—" Jackson whipped around. "You questioning me?" Davis swallowed and shook his head. "No, sir." "Then get it done." Davis pulled out a pair of handcuffs and approached Barron. "Please don't make this harder than it needs to be," he said quietly, almost pleading. Barron felt a surge of panic but forced himself to remain still. "This is insane," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I'm not resisting." But Davis was already snapping the cuffs into place. Barron flinched at the cold metal against his wrists. Jackson smirked. "See? Was that so hard?" A sudden flash from the road caught their attention. A car slowed as it passed, its headlights illuminating the scene. The driver stared, and Barron saw the faint glow of a phone screen inside the car. Someone was recording. Jackson noticed it too, his expression hardening. "Keep moving," he shouted at the passing car. The driver hesitated but eventually sped up, leaving Barron's heart pounding. "You're really enjoying this, aren't you?" Barron said, unable to stop himself. Jackson's eyes flicked back to him. "What did you say?" Barron didn't answer. Jackson stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You don't know how things work out here, do you?" Barron held his ground, refusing to look away. "Why don't you tell me?" Jackson's mouth twitched, but before he could respond, Davis interrupted. "Sir, we didn't find anything." Jackson's eyes snapped to Davis. "Check again." "We already did, twice." "Then check him." Davis hesitated. "Search him." Barron's breath hitched as Davis approached again, but this time he saw the hesitation, the silent apology in the younger officer's eyes. "This is unnecessary," Barron said, his voice low but firm. Jackson ignored him. Davis patted him down, his touch quick but clinical. He stepped back and shook his head. "Nothing, sir." Jackson looked Barron up and down, as if deciding whether or not to push further. "You got lucky this time," he finally said, but his tone carried a threat. Davis stepped aside, clearly uncomfortable with the entire exchange. "Can I go now?" Barron asked, his voice strained. Jackson didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer and leaned in. "This isn't over," he said quietly. He turned and walked back toward the patrol car. Davis lingered for a moment before unlocking the cuffs. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Barron didn't respond. His eyes followed Jackson as he spoke into his radio, but the words were lost under the roar of an approaching engine. Barron looked up just in time to see a convoy of black SUVs crest the hill, their headlights cutting through the darkness like spotlights. His heart leapt. She was here. The vehicles pulled up, and before anyone could react, the doors swung open. Security personnel in suits and earpieces stepped out first, moving with precision and purpose. And then, from the lead SUV, Melania Trump emerged. Her heels clicked sharply against the gravel as she strode toward them, her presence commanding. Jackson straightened, suddenly unsure of himself. "Ma'am, Melania didn't let him finish. "What is going on here?" she demanded, her voice sharp and cold. Barron exhaled, relief washing over him, but the night was far from over. Melania Trump's heels struck the gravel with sharp, deliberate clicks as she advanced towards the two officers. The air seemed to thicken with tension, and every movement, from the adjusting of earpieces by her security team to the subtle shifting of weight by the officers, felt amplified. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her presence alone demanded attention. Barron's breath hitched as he watched his mother approach, her expression locked in a mask of icy control. He had seen her like this before, at press conferences, interviews, and public events, but never had her composure felt so personal, so protective. Jackson straightened his posture, quickly wiping his palms on his uniform pants. His eyes darted between Melania and the SUVs still idling behind her, their tinted windows concealing whoever else might be inside. "Ma'am," he began, forcing a professional tone, "I need you to step back. We're in the middle of an investigation." Melania didn't slow her pace. "Investigation?" she repeated, her accent giving the word a sharper edge. "Of what, exactly?" Jackson faltered, but quickly recovered. "We stopped this young man because his behavior was suspicious. He was driving an expensive vehicle, late at night, in an area known for—" She raised her hand, cutting him off. "This young man," she said, her voice steady but edged with steel, "is my son." "This young man," she said, her voice steady but edged with steel, "is my son." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Davis, the younger officer, visibly paled. Jackson, however, stiffened his jaw. "We didn't know that at the time, ma'am. Regardless, we have procedures to follow." Melania tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. "Procedures? Is that what you call this?" She gestured toward Barron, whose wrist still bore faint red marks from the cuffs. "Cuffing an unarmed teenager and throwing his phone to the ground, treating him like a criminal without cause." Jackson opened his mouth to respond, but Melania stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "I have seen this before," she said, her voice lowering, but losing none of its intensity. "Men like you, who think a badge gives them power to humiliate others, who enjoy making people feel small." Jackson flinched but quickly masked it with a defensive glare. "That's not what happened here." Melania's lips tightened. "Then explain it to me. Explain it to the people who are already recording this," she said, gesturing toward the cluster of bystanders further down the road, phones raised and capturing every second. Explain it to the thousands who will see it online before the night is over. Jackson's confidence wavered, but he dug in. This is protocol, he snapped. We don't give anyone special treatment, no matter who they are. Special treatment? Melania repeated, her tone sharp enough to cut. My son didn't ask for special treatment. He asked to be treated fairly. Davis took a hesitant step forward, his voice barely more than a murmur. Ma'am, we didn't find anything. He's clear. Melania turned to him, her gaze softening just slightly. Then why is he still standing here? Davis's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Unlock his cuffs, Melania ordered. Davis hesitated, glancing at Jackson. That's not your call, Jackson snapped. Melania's security team stepped forward in unison. Their movements were calm but deliberate, the weight of their presence undeniable. One of them, a tall man with sharp features and an earpiece, addressed Jackson directly. Ma'am's request is not up for discussion, he said. Unlock the cuffs. Jackson's face turned red, but he relented. With a sharp nod at Davis, he barked, Do it! Davis fumbled with the key and quickly released Barron's wrists. Barron rubbed his wrist, feeling the sting where the cuffs had pressed against his skin. His mother stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm briefly before she turned back to the officers. This isn't over, she said, her voice low but unwavering. I want to know why my son was treated like this. I want names, reports, and body cam footage. And I want it now. Jackson swallowed hard. I'll have to contact my supervisor. Contact them, Melania interrupted. And let them know that if I don't get answers, I'll make sure this department gets national attention for all the wrong reasons. Jackson opened his mouth to argue, but Melania's security chief spoke again. We've already contacted federal authorities, he said. They'll be here shortly to assist with the situation. The words landed like a blow. Jackson's shoulders slumped slightly, but his expression remained defiant. Melania turned back to Barron, brushing a strand of hair from his face. Are you hurt? Barron shook his head, though his voice came out strained. No, but... She squeezed his arm gently. Good, that's all that matters. But Barron wasn't convinced. He could still feel the weight of the flashlight against his shoulder, the threat in Jackson's voice, and the helplessness that had boiled in his chest. Melania turned to her security team. Get him out of here. Take him to the SUV. Barron hesitated. What about them? He asked, nodding toward the officers. Melania's eyes didn't waver. They'll get what they deserve. As Barron walked toward the safety of the SUVs, flanked by security, he stole a final glance over his shoulder. Jackson stood rigid, his face pale but set in a hard scowl. Davis looked away, unable to meet Barron's eyes. The door of the SUV opened, and Barron stepped inside, the tension in his shoulders refusing to ease. From inside, he could see his mother still standing her ground, speaking to the officers in low, deliberate tones. Her silhouette against the flashing police lights seemed almost untouchable, like she belonged to a different world entirely. But Barron knew better. She wasn't untouchable, and neither was he. As the SUV pulled away, Barron pressed his forehead against the cool glass and exhaled, knowing that the night was far from over. The SUV's interior felt stifling despite the hum of the air conditioning. Barron sat in the back seat, his fingers absently tracing the faint red marks left by the cuffs. The tinted windows blurred the scene outside, but flashes of blue and red lights bled through, keeping the moment alive in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that the night was far from over. Through the glass, he watched his mother, a silhouette framed by security agents and the two officers who now looked far less certain than they had moments ago. Melania stood tall, her arms crossed, and her voice, though muffled, carried a weight that even Barron could feel from inside the vehicle. One of the agents in the front seat adjusted his earpiece and turned slightly toward Barron. "Sir, federal agents will be here shortly. Your mother's instructed us to stay put until she gives further orders." Barron nodded without speaking. He wasn't sure what frustrated him more, the humiliation he'd just endured or the fact that he couldn't do anything about it. He had always been told to stay calm, to let adults handle these situations, but tonight had made it clear that even calmness wasn't enough. A movement outside the SUV caught his attention. Jackson had stepped away from the group and was talking into his radio. His face was red, his free hand clenched into a fist. From the tension in his shoulders, Barron knew he was trying to salvage what was left of his authority. Davis, meanwhile, lingered by the police cruiser, his posture slouched, his gaze flickering toward Melania and then down at the ground. The sudden arrival of another set of headlights broke the tension. Two black sedans rolled up, their windows tinted even darker than Melania's convoy. The doors opened simultaneously, and three men in dark suits stepped out. FBI. Barron sat up straighter, his breath catching as the agents approached. Jackson's expression shifted from defiance to unease, and Davis took an involuntary step back. Melania turned to the agents as they approached, her posture unchanging. "I trust you've been briefed," she said without preamble. "Yes, ma'am," the lead agent replied. He was tall, bald, with sharp eyes that immediately swept over the scene before settling on Jackson. "We've reviewed the preliminary footage." Jackson stiffened. "That footage doesn't tell the whole story," he said quickly. "We followed protocol." The agent raised a hand, silencing him. "We'll determine that, but right now, Officer Jackson, I need you to hand over your badge and weapon." Barron saw the panic flicker in Jackson's eyes before he forced it down. "You can't be serious." The agent stepped closer. "Now." For the first time, Jackson hesitated, his hand hovering near his holster as if the weight of the weapon could anchor him. Davis, seeing the situation unraveling, stepped forward. "Sir, just do it," he said softly. Jackson's eyes darted to him, the betrayal evident, but after a moment he unclipped his badge and holster, handing them over with sharp, jerky movements. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. The agent didn't respond. Instead, he turned to Davis. "You too." Davis looked surprised. "Me? You failed to de-escalate the situation. That makes you complicit." Davis swallowed hard, but didn't argue. He removed his badge and weapon, his hands shaking slightly as he handed them over. Barron watched from the SUV, his fingers tightening into fists. He didn't feel satisfaction, only exhaustion. It wasn't enough. Melania stepped closer to the agents. "I want the footage reviewed in full. I want a public statement issued by morning acknowledging the misconduct, and I want this department audited. If this happened to my son, it's happened to others." The lead agent nodded. "We've already started the process, ma'am." "Good." She turned, walking toward the SUV without another word. The officers stood frozen as the agents continued their investigation, their careers unraveling in real time. When Melania climbed into the SUV and closed the door behind her, the air inside felt heavier. She exhaled slowly, her eyes meeting Barron's. "Are you all right?" Barron hesitated before nodding. "I'm fine." Her gaze lingered, searching his face for cracks in the mask she knew he wore too well. "No, you're not." Barron looked away, his fingers tightening around his knees. "They threw my phone on the ground." "We'll get you a new one." "That's not the point," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. "They treated me like I was dangerous, like I didn't belong there." Melania's expression hardened. "And now they're paying for it." "But what about the next time?" Barron asked. "What about someone who doesn't have you to show up with bodyguards and FBI agents?" Melania's jaw tightened, but before she could answer, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and then back at Barron. "This isn't over," she said, her voice quieter but no less firm. "We're going to make sure it doesn't happen again." The SUV began to move, pulling away from the scene. Barron watched as the flashing lights receded into the distance, the officers now shadows against the glow of police cars and federal agents. But even as the lights disappeared, the weight of what had happened lingered. He knew this wasn't just about him, it was about something bigger, something that wouldn't be fixed with apologies and firings. He leaned back against the seat, his mother's words echoing in his mind. This isn't over. The morning after the incident unfolded like a wildfire. By the time the first rays of sunlight stretched across the Dallas skyline, the videos taken by bystanders had already gone viral. Clips showing Barron Trump being cuffed and humiliated by police officers were circulating on every major social media platform. Headlines blared accusations of racial profiling, abuse of power, and systemic corruption. Barron sat at the long marble kitchen counter in their hotel suite, a cup of untouched coffee cooling beside him. His phone buzzed endlessly with notifications, articles, comments, and mentions flooding his feed. He had scrolled through dozens of posts, each one angrier than the last. If this can happen to Barron Trump, imagine what happens to kids without famous parents. Wealth and privilege didn't protect him. What chance do the rest of us have? Fire those officers now. Barron dropped his phone onto the counter, the sound echoing through the empty space. His stomach churned. He hadn't even wanted this attention. He just wanted to go home. But now his name was everywhere again, tied to controversy and scandal. The suite door opened, and Melania stepped inside. She was followed closely by her chief of security and a polished woman in a gray skirt suit carrying a tablet. Melania's hair was swept back into a sleek bun, and she moved with the same air of control that she had the night before. "They're already talking about protests outside the police station," the woman in the skirt suit said, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "CNN and Fox News are both running the footage in loops, and the hashtags #JusticeForBarron and #StopTheAbuse are trending globally." Melania set her purse down and glanced at Barron. "Have you eaten?" Barron shook his head. "You should eat." "I'm not hungry." She gave him a long look but didn't press the issue. Instead, she turned to the woman with the tablet. "Schedule interviews, morning shows, afternoon panels, I want them all, and have the lawyers finalize our statement." The woman nodded and slipped out of the room, leaving Melania alone with Barron. "You need to be ready," she said, sitting down across from him. "For what?" "For the questions," she replied. "People are watching, and they want answers. You have to decide what you want to say." Barron frowned. "What I want to say doesn't matter," he muttered. "People have already decided what this is about." Melania folded her hands on the counter. "You're wrong," she said softly but firmly. "You have a voice, Barron. Use it." Her words hung in the air, but before Barron could respond, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and stood. "They're ready for us downstairs." The press conference was held in the hotel's ballroom, its chandeliers gleaming under the harsh light of camera flashes. Reporters filled the space, their voices merging into a low, restless hum. Barron stood at the edge of the platform just out of sight, his heart pounding. He could see his mother at the podium, flanked by lawyers and security. She looked composed, untouchable, but he knew better. He'd seen her pacing in the suite earlier, rehearsing her words and tightening her jaw whenever anger threatened to slip through her carefully constructed mask. "This is not just about my son," Melania began, her voice carrying easily over the noise. "This is about every person who has been mistreated by those in power. This is about accountability." Barron watched the reporters scribble furiously in their notebooks, their cameras clicking nonstop. No one should be made to feel powerless because of their name, their appearance, or their background. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Melania paused, letting the moment settle before continuing. "We demand answers. We demand reforms. And we will not stop until real change is made." The applause was immediate. It swelled through the room, loud and insistent. Barron flinched at the sound, his pulse quickening. He wasn't ready for this, but then Melania stepped aside, and all eyes turned toward him. The room seemed to close in as he stepped up to the microphone. His hands gripped the edges of the podium, and his breath felt too shallow. "My name is Barron Trump," he began. His voice wavered slightly, but he pressed on. "And last night, I was treated like a criminal for no reason." He paused, searching the crowd. Faces stared back, some sympathetic, others skeptical, all waiting for him to give them something. "I was scared," he admitted, his voice stronger this time. "Not because I did anything wrong, but because I knew it didn't matter. I knew the second they saw my name, they made up their minds about who I was." A few cameras zoomed in closer. He swallowed and continued. "I'm lucky," he said. "Lucky my mom was there to help me. Lucky that people were watching. But what happens to the people no one sees? What happens to the people who can't call someone to rescue them?" The crowd fell silent. Even the camera shutters stopped. "This can't keep happening," he finished, his voice breaking slightly. "Not to me, not to anyone." He stepped back, heart pounding, and Melania returned to the podium. "Thank you," she said, her voice smooth and practiced. "We'll be taking no further questions at this time." The noise erupted again as reporters shouted over each other, but security was already moving in, guiding them out of the room. That night, Barron sat in his hotel room, scrolling through the comments online. People were calling him brave. Some were calling him entitled. Others were already picking apart his speech, analyzing every word. He tossed the phone aside and leaned back against the headboard. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "You have a voice. Use it." He didn't feel brave. He felt exhausted. But as he stared at the ceiling, the truth settled over him. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It never had been. The hotel suite was quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic outside the windows. Barron sat on the couch, his posture slouched and his gaze fixed on the muted television screen. News anchors debated the fallout of the incident. His name scrolled endlessly along the ticker, accompanied by words like controversy and accountability. His phone vibrated again. He ignored it. It had been less than 24 hours since the press conference, but it already felt like a lifetime. The weight of the speech still lingered in his chest, a knot of anxiety and exhaustion. He hadn't wanted to speak, hadn't wanted to become a symbol, but the world seemed to have decided otherwise. He picked up his phone and scrolled through the messages. Some were supportive, others hateful. One comment stood out. "Must be nice to have your mom and the security team show up when things go wrong. What about the rest of us?" Barron exhaled sharply and tossed the phone onto the table. It was the question that had been haunting him since the cuffs snapped shut around his wrists. What about the people who didn't have someone to call? The door to the suite opened and Melania stepped inside. She was still dressed in her tailored suit, though the top button of her blouse was undone, a rare sign of weariness. She carried a folder in one hand and her phone in the other. "You should be sleeping," she said, setting the folder down and crossing the room. Barron didn't look up. "Can't." Melania paused, studying him for a moment before sitting down across from him. "They fired him," she said. Barron glanced up. "Jackson?" She nodded. "And the other one?" "Suspended, pending investigation." Barron let the information sink in. He should have felt relief, but instead there was a hollow ache in his chest. "It's not enough," he said quietly. Melania's expression didn't change. "I know." They sat in silence for a moment before she leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "Today wasn't just about you, Barron. It was about making people see what happens when authority is abused. And they saw it." Barron looked away. "But what happens tomorrow?" he asked. "What happens to the next person who doesn't have cameras or a famous mom to back them up?" Melania's lips pressed into a thin line. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she said. "But you started something. Now you have to decide what you're going to do with it." Barron shook his head. "I didn't ask for this. No one ever does." Her words lingered in the air. Barron rubbed his palms over his knees, his thoughts spinning. "I just wanted to go home," he said, his voice breaking slightly. Melania reached across and squeezed his hand. "And now you're here," she said. "You can let this define you, or you can use it." Barron pulled his hand away gently and stood up. "I don't even know where to start." Melania rose too, smoothing her skirt. "Start by telling the truth." Later that night, Barron sat on the edge of his bed, his laptop open in front of him. He stared at the blank screen for a long time before finally opening Twitter. His hands hovered over the keyboard as he struggled to find the right words. He thought about the officers, the fear he'd felt, and the way Jackson had smirked at him like he was less than human. He thought about Davis, who had hesitated but hadn't stopped it. And he thought about the people online, the ones who saw themselves in his story and the ones who didn't. Finally, he started typing. "Last night, I experienced something no one should ever have to go through. I was judged, questioned, and humiliated because of assumptions, not facts. I know I was lucky. My mom came, cameras were there. But I also know that for so many people, this is just their reality. This isn't just about me. It's about fairness, accountability, and respect. No one should have to feel helpless in the face of authority. We need to do better." He hit post and set the laptop aside. The message was already gaining traction by the time he closed the lid. The next morning, Barron woke to find his phone flooded with notifications. His post had gone viral overnight, sparking a new wave of debates and demands for reform. Journalists quoted his words. Activists called for accountability. Even politicians weighed in, promising investigations and legislative changes. Barron scrolled through the comments. Some praised him. Others accused him of playing the victim. But most were asking what came next. He wasn't sure he had an answer. By mid-morning, Melania was back in the suite, surrounded by her staff and security. Barron stood by the window, looking out at the city below. "There's already talk about policy changes," Melania said, "body cam regulations, de-escalation training." Barron didn't turn around. "And what happens when people forget?" Melania approached him, her voice softer this time. "Then you remind them." Barron finally looked at her, and for the first time he saw something that caught him off guard: pride. "You're stronger than you think," she said. Barron didn't respond. Instead, he picked up his phone again, staring at the messages pouring in. Questions, stories, people who wanted to be heard. He started typing. By evening, Barron's post had become more than just a statement. It had become a movement. People began sharing their own stories of mistreatment, flooding social media with accounts of fear and injustice. Melania watched from the other side of the room as Barron scrolled through the messages, his expression shifting from uncertainty to determination. It wasn't the ending either of them had expected, but it was a beginning. Barron set the phone down and looked at his mother. "Let's do something about this." She smiled. "We already are." That night, as Barron lay in bed, he thought about the road, the flashing lights, and the cold press of metal against his wrists. He thought about Jackson's sneer and Davis's hesitation. He knew the fear would stay with him, but so would the resolve. Because Melania had been right. This wasn't over. It was just the start. Thank you for watching this video. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories, and share this video with your friends. Let it be the start of an important conversation. Watch other videos on the channel for more thought-provoking stories.